welcome to this week's book club episode of Star Wars Aftermath Life Debt. If you are unfamiliar with what's going on here, go ahead and click here and it will take you back to the beginning of our series on this book. Basically, we are going through Life Debt a couple of chapters at a time in order to kind of dig deep into the theme. So, for example, today we're talking about chapters 29 and 30. If you would like to join us from the beginning of our journey, you can click here and it will take you back to our playlist on Aftermath, the first book in the Aftermath trilogy. This is book 2. And it would be fun to have you join us and get into this discussion with us. But with that, let's get into today's stuff. There's so much to talk about. Like I said, these were two very long chapters, which is fine. We're starting out part 5. So this time, there's a bit of a time jump. The story has moved ahead 1 month. So we have 1 month since Brenton has been returned back to his family, and 1 month since the rest of the Aftermath crew has been on Kashyyyk. We get our update on the Wexley family by having a conversation with Wedge and Nora, and you get the feeling that this is one of the few times they've really actually spoken in this last month. Remember, they were on the cusp of a budding romance until Nora's husband came back into play. It's awkward. It's awkward for the two of them because they want to be friends, and it's not like anything really happened. You know, they hadn't formally started dating, things hadn't gone too far, but it's still kind of rough because the feelings were there and the feelings were real. And so Wedge is trying to be very respectful, and he's trying to let go of how he feels, and he's trying not to alienate Nora or make her feel rejected because of what she's going through. And of course, Nora doesn't want to lose Wedge. She cares a lot about him, but she is respecting her marriage that she didn't realize was still a thing, and yet here they are. Their relationship is definitely a thing that's awkward between them. It's a thing they're constantly talking around. It's a thing that kind of makes them panic anytime one of them gets a little bit too close, that sort of thing, and it's definitely something tough that they have to work through. But Nora also really appreciates being able to talk to Wedge because she's got a lot on her chest. She talks about how she blames herself for Brenton. You know, he's back, but he's not really back. You know, he's suffering from his time being unconscious, from his time in this like battery coma that he was in, and she wants to be there for him. You know, she still loves him, she still loves Brenton, but he's different and she's different. She had to grow into a different person without him, and she had to move on, and that's a difficult thing to backtrack on. And that's just a type of guilt that's really tricky because what she's feeling is completely normal and it's what anyone would go through. And it's one of those things where you think you know what the right thing is. You think you know the right thing is to just be there for the person who's clearly been this victim for however many years. But it's just not that easy, and Nora, who's exceptionally good at beating herself up over things, is continuing to beat herself up. And it doesn't help that, of course, Timon has kind of sided with Brenton in this thing where sides need not be taken. Timon being much younger and trying to deal with all this. I don't know, when I was a kid, I always hated everyone telling me, like, you're just a child, you'll understand when you get older. And not that I'm particularly old now, but I'm starting to kind of get it, just how perspective changes as you get older. And so I don't necessarily want to become one of those finger waggers. But for Timon, he's hitting the first point in his life where he really changes, right? He's a teenager. Teenager is kind of the point where you stop just being the pure essence of yourself. I mean, you have opinions, but a lot of that is informed on your direct environment around you. Timon has reached this point where he can now decide if he wants to have the opinions of his parents, the opinions of his government, the opinions of what have you, or who he is. So Timon doesn't really have this perspective of how people change, because he's kind of changing for the first time, at least personality-wise. And it's this point you realize just how isolated Nora is. She has her husband back, but he's not her husband. She has her son back, but their relationship's tense. She has Wedge, but her feelings with him are complicated and dangerous. She finally found friends and doesn't have them anymore because they're off on Kashyyyk helping people, something that she'd want to do, and instead she's back trying to fix her family and she doesn't know how to do it. So she's this woman who's been, this entire time that we've known her, this entire time we've seen her in these books, constantly surrounded by people, and now she's either away from those people or has to keep herself in a guarded position around them. And to that point, let's talk about Timon. Nora seems so convinced that Timon is just fine with everything going on with Brenton, and yet Timon isn't. Timon is trying to fix Bones. He's frustrated. His dad is supposed to be helping him. Instead, his dad is on walks, doing things, constantly distracted. Timon understands that he needs to be there for his dad too, and that his dad is going through some things, and he understands that things are different, but he doesn't really know what to do with those emotions. He doesn't really understand this whole people change thing, and so he kind of reverts back on what he's been doing his whole life, which is he blames Nora. He doesn't necessarily know how to tell that his dad is different, because he really just has memories of his dad from when he was younger. So he sees his dad, and his dad isn't fitting his memory, and his dad probably wouldn't fit his memory no matter what, just because time does that. The only thing he can think of is, well, he sees his mom, and he sees how his mom is being different, therefore it must be mom's fault. And it's less that I think he really truly blames her, as much as Nora is something that's tangible, something that's there, something he can point to and say, okay, yeah, it's definitely your fault. And that's a very normal thing. So there's a lot of really big, complex emotions going on in their family right now. Speaking of awkward family dynamics, the other thing that goes on in this chapter is has to do with Leia. So Leia is still struggling. She wants the New Republic to help out on Kashyyyk. She wants her husband back. She wants the father of her child back. There's so many things up in the air, and her supposed friend, and she is her friend, they're just kind of seeing things a little bit differently right now, of Mon Mothma, is just not doing what Leia wants. And I think the pressure is on for Leia, because now this peace treaty's coming. And if this peace treaty happens and Kashyyyk ends up in Imperial hands, then the New Republic can't take Kashyyyk back. It just becomes this issue where it's now or never. They have to make this strike before the galaxy is at peace. Which is an interesting thing to think about anyways, this idea of you've wanted peace this whole time, and you want to end the suffering and the fighting, but, you know, getting peace for part of the galaxy could come at the expense of subjugation still for everyone, if you don't get around to freeing everyone. And that's kind of the idea of, when is peace more important, and when is it more important to kind of keep fighting? That is the big conflict right now between Leia and Mon Mothma. Leia and Mon Mothma in these books are kind of set up as these two poles of opposition. You know, Mon Mothma is the one that's so terrified of becoming Palpatine. This is something we heard from her earlier in the book. You know, she doesn't want to be like him. She doesn't want to have all of these powers and be corrupted. As such, she's almost afraid of her own power. She's trying to lessen the military. She's trying to lessen her own powers. She wants peace as soon as possible, and she's kind of running in that direction. And then here you have Leia, and Leia doesn't want to stop until, you know, every Imperial is done. Leia has a quote in this passage that just says, "I would burn the whole galaxy down if I thought it was right." I think these two opposing viewpoints are very important to tell, and I think they're being set up to kind of show the extremes of both of these viewpoints, and how dangerous that is. You know, you clearly have Mon Mothma. We don't know what it is yet, but we have Mon Mothma moving, presumably headlong, into Rax's plan, because Rax is plotting this attack on Chandrila, the planet they're on, and we don't know what it is, but we also know that Rax is clearly not bothered by these peace talks, so we know that Mon Mothma's wrong, because we know the story. And even though she has these great intentions, and even though lessening power so that corrupt can't take it, and wanting to end a war are all noble goals, we know that she's trying to do the right thing, but it's taking her down the wrong path. But then you have Leia, and Leia is... I have a hard time with Leia's characterization in these books. I can't decide if it's incredibly nuanced to a point of being utterly correct or completely wrong. And I kind of waffle between the two. And I think that's also because I have a lot of issues with Mon Mothma's characterization in this book. So, if you know Mon Mothma from Rogue One, if you know Mon Mothma from Rebels, she's definitely the cooler head. She's definitely the let's be diplomatic and let that kind of prevail. But Mon Mothma is not afraid of a fight. We know Leia is a Spitfire. We know Leia wants to get the job done. But we also know Leia is a diplomat. So what we have here is these two women that have been leading the rebellion. And what has made them so strong is that they are both not afraid of action, but also inclined to use action not as a first resort. And what I'm seeing here is a very passive Mon Mothma and a very aggressive Leia, and I feel like both characterizations are forgetting half of the character. And I almost feel like their characters have been exaggerated to one of these two viewpoints in order to better tell the story, but to tell a better story at the expense of the characterization, if that makes sense. Because I don't think Mon Mothma would feel right about not helping Kashyyyk. That said, she doesn't feel right in the book about not helping Kashyyyk. She just says that there's a lot of planets like Kashyyyk. I think Leia would be this angry and would want to help Kashyyyk this much, but it feels so personal, and I feel like Leia has more strength of character to recognize that within herself. Now, I say all this, but I'm basing my understanding of Mon Mothma off of pre-A New Hope stuff. Right? Pre-Death Star blowing up Alderaan. You know, this is Mon Mothma when she's fighting a war, but it hadn't gotten really bad yet. And then we're seeing Mon Mothma after the Galactic Civil War, more burned out. And that personality can make sense. And we see Leia coming off of knowing war for so long. Like, being raised in war. You know, she's only 19 in A New Hope. So she's been at this for a long time. See her kind of transition from a war government to a peaceful government, it would be difficult. And she probably would err a little bit more on the side of aggression. So I guess that's what I'm saying is, like, I don't think the characterizations are wrong, and maybe they're just hyper correct for this moment in galactic history. It's just the Leia in this book doesn't feel like the Leia in Bloodline or the Leia in the sequel trilogy, but there's also 20-ish years in between this book and Bloodline and then the sequel trilogy. I don't know, I can't tell if my own personal biases are getting in the way of this or not, but it's something that I kind of feel that this conflict between the two characters is kind of set up to make a point, but to make a point without using the characters in the way the characters would be used properly. Anyway, I'm very curious for those of you watching how you felt about Leia in this, just because I'm kind of undecided myself. So I would love to know, like, how did you feel reading Leia in this? Either if you haven't read a lot of other EU material, Legends, or current, I would really like to hear what you have to say, because you would have less kind of clouding your preconceived notions as you read the book, which is definitely a benefit at times. But if you have read a lot of other stuff too, I'd like to know how you think she compares. But I've been on that point for quite a while, so why don't we go ahead and flip the page and then just get on to Chapter 30. So Chapter 30, we finally see the rest of the Aftermath crew. They're on Kashyyyk. They've been on Kashyyyk for a month. They're making their final play on the guy that runs Kashyyyk. Tolric reminds me a lot, actually, of Ozzik Stern from the Force Unleashed game, which was a very similar kind of thing. Kashyyyk was under Imperial control, led by a governor who liked to hunt. He liked to hunt wild beasts, considered Wookiees wild beasts. The Wookiees kind of had chips in their head, so it feels very similar. I don't know if that was accidental. I don't know if that was intentionally pulling on lore. I don't know if that's just the most logical way to handle Kashyyyk, and so two people kind of came to the same conclusion. Either way, it was familiar, as dark and depressing as this familiarity is. But I liked reading Tolric's characterization, because they describe him becoming so beast-like. He growls like a Wookiee. He uses some Shrill words. It's described as he's becoming like feral, trapped on this planet, and he likes that about himself, and that's something he's aware of in himself. He stinks like the planet, and he likes it. He's also going nuts on a drug that's made by tree sap, so that's another fun thing. The Wookiees are going through absolutely horrendous things. It's kind of interesting. They've kept up Imperial breeding programs for the Wookiees, but have absolutely nowhere to put the Wookiees. They have like an overpopulation problem with Wookiees. As horrible as a breeding program is, I don't even know how to like get into how bad that is. To do that and then be so inefficient as to realize that you don't need to be doing it as much. Like, not even from in an altruistic, oh, maybe I should have better ethics and not make Wookiees breed. But even from an efficiency standpoint of, I don't have anywhere to put these guys. Like, we're literally just gonna keep going on with the directives. It's just such an Imperial thing, a weird Imperial thing. The story point in this is Jom has been captured. Jom has had his eye removed as a form of torture. He's in a bad way. He's caught in a cage. Sinjir does what Sinjir likes to do, which is go in, pretend to be an Imperial, and he has this grand scheme. He gets found out, and everything looks really bad. Sinjir's in a fight. Sinjir is not much of a fighter. He can't really maintain himself, and you're getting real worried. Meanwhile, Solo, Jazz, and company are trying to sneak in, and you get warnings of big, scary Kashyyyk spiders, which are probably a lot like the spiders in The Hobbit, I would assume. Two characters that we see in this chapter are Hatchet and Palabar. They are friends with the Wookiee Greybuck. I mentioned Greybuck before. He was in the Aftermath Prime Interlude 8, and Hatchet and Palabar are the other two characters in that. So they are the three people that escaped the Imperial world that had Rancors on it and all that stuff, and they're still together, they're still hanging out. The other two are just kind of along for the ride, and they're not sure why they're there, but they're there, and so it's cool continuing to see how these things connect. I enjoyed, there's a exchange between Jazz and Solo. Earlier in the book, they'd had an exchange about who was the better shot, and they were both indignantly sure that they were the best shot. Here Solo decides to compromise. Solo is better with a blaster, and Jazz is better with a rifle, and I thought that was just kind of a cute character point. But just when everything's looking really bad, it looks like Sinjir's about to die, Jom's caught in this cage, it looks like the bad guy's gonna keep all of the things, you find out that Sinjir has actually been able to, like, hack into a computer, or at least, it might have been one of Greybuck's buddies, because it was implied that he was a really good computer guy, but either way, Sinjir gets a signal inside of this great castle, and hacks the computers that has all of the Wookiees' inhibitor chips. So even though they're not able to, like, militarily storm and take this stronghold, they're able to free the Wookiees. And because they can free the Wookiees all across the planet, there's finally this resistance that can rise up and take Kashyyyk back. And then just when everything was looking bad and then everything was looking good, it all starts to look bad again, because Tulruk decides that if he can't have Kashyyyk, no one's gonna have Kashyyyk, and he orders his Star Destroyers in space to start raining fire down on the planet to destroy the surface. So we're gonna kind of come back to the Kashyyyk story from the next point, from that point, to figure out how they solve it from there. One interesting kind of thing that happens to Tulruk is when Jom gets freed by Sinjir, Jom wants to chase after Tulruk and get revenge. He wants to get revenge for his eye, he wants to get revenge for all of Kashyyyk. He's so angry, and Sinjir's kind of like, no, we need to get the heck out of here. Jom eventually gives up on this, and they get rescued. And then Tulruk is actually killed by one of his Wookiee slaves. And the book's description of this Wookiee slave is that she was always one of the most compliant, one of the most respectful, and she just destroys Tulruk in the end and rips him apart. It kind of made me think of justice, and I'm trying to think of how to put this. We often see bad things in the world, right? And I kind of see this kind of Twitter justice out there, because I'm on Twitter a lot to advertise our site, and I see a lot of people who see somebody doing something real scummy, and they like to put it on blast. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think so long as you are not becoming the thing that you are so mad about and the thing you're trying to fight, I think calling out garbage is important. But I always find it interesting the people who like to call things out. And I think there's a certain type of person on Twitter, and this is not everybody, but there's a certain type of person on Twitter that likes to call out garbage because it makes them feel better about their own garbage. If they're insecure about some time in their life that they've said something bad to someone, or they've been mean to someone, or they've brushed someone off, they can call out this other person, and then they can kind of feel absolved of their own thing that they did. And I see this a lot in internet debates in general, where somebody will be doing something and people will be trying to calm the situation down. They'll be like, well, don't you think this person deserves to have this happen to them because they did this bad thing? And there's more to it than that, because the person could deserve to be called out. The person could deserve this negative attention. That doesn't mean you deserve to be the person that gives the justice. And I think this kind of misplaced justice is an issue. So Jom had every reason to hate Tulruk. This isn't exactly the same. You know, Jom had been in prison for a while. I don't know if it was the whole month, but he'd been in prison for a while. He'd been made a fool of for a while. He'd had his eye taken. So he had reason to hate this guy's guts. But did he deserve to take this guy's life in revenge? Versus a Wookiee who has been made a slave for a long time, has been made subhuman, or for lack of a better word, human, for a long time. She has been brutalized, she's watched her people be murdered. Between Jom and this Wookiee, who deserved to get revenge on Tolruk more? And would Jom being the one to do it rob the Wookiees of their own justice? Now, I'm not a big believer in murder for justice anyway. It's not the Jedi way, to put it tritely, but it was something interesting when I was reading this, that Jom so badly wanted to run and get revenge on this guy, but it's like, why, Jom? Like, you haven't been here that long. It wasn't even his cause. He didn't even really want to stay. He was mostly staying because he had the hots for Jazz. Like, he didn't really have the right to decide Tolruk's fate. But this Wookiee, she did. Or at least any Wookiee under his rule. And that was something that I thought was kind of interesting, thinking about it too. And like I said, relating that back to real life, it's like, yeah, maybe this person is trash and deserves to be called trash, but are you really the one that gets to decide that? And I think that's a very, very human element that often comes from our own insecurities, and our need to absolve ourselves of the secret things that only we know about in our own minds. Not to get too deep and heavy. So on that note, that's the video. That's what I got. Those are my thoughts for today. I hope you all enjoyed these chapters. Like I said, we're getting into some big, interesting stuff. For next week, we're going to read the interlude on Hosnian Prime, which is the next thing in the book. Hosnian Prime, of course, becomes the capital of the New Republic sometime in between what we're reading now and, well, Bloodline, but the sequel trilogy in general. And then we're going to read chapters 31, 32, and 33. So that is 4 things to discuss, and it's only about 20 pages. So we go from reading 2 things over 60 pages to reading 4 things over 20. Thus, the chapter pacing in this book continues to confuse me, but that's fine. But we'll discuss those 4 things next week. Please, like I said, leave me a comment on your thoughts, especially about Leia, because that was the thing I'm really trying to work out, but really anything I hit on in this video, or anything you might think I'm misrepresenting or understanding, or any of that type of stuff. I always love hearing from you guys. Make sure you're following us on all of the socials and all of the places, and I'll talk to you guys next week.